Thank you. Well, I'm excited for you to get to meet Professor Hugh Cagle today. He's not terribly far away at the University of Utah, but this is his first time visiting us here, and we're really delighted that he's taken the time to do that. He is the Director of International Studies at the University of Utah. He's also an associate professor in the Department of History. He is a specialist in Latin American history, particularly Brazil. He's also done work in comparative Portuguese colonialism, and he does work in the history of science as well. So his book, which is really quite fascinating, is called Assembling the Tropics, published in 2018, that brings together multiple disciplines, the histories of science, medicine, and geography, to show that the tropics is not necessarily a place, but is a political project. And he lives in Salt Lake City. He is a great champion of environmental sustainability. He is the co-parent of a German Shepherd. If you enjoy German Shepherds, he's a great guy to talk to. And we're just really, really delighted to welcome him here today. He's going to be speaking on a multi-species history of plantation capitalism in Brazil, focusing in the area around 1600. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hugh Cagle to BYU.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Quinn, and to BYU for the invitation. Thanks to the staff at the Kennedy Center for making this possible. And I want to thank all of you for spending at least part of your afternoon with me here today. Quick caveat, maybe a couple of quick caveats. This has been an ongoing project for a few years now. I'm happy to talk about what the process of writing a book looks like behind the scenes, but I'll just tell you the bits and pieces that I'm trying to pull together into this presentation are bits and pieces that I actually wrote up originally for my first book project. And then I was sitting there about to submit the manuscript and thought to myself, the bits and pieces of this story are actually too interesting to be buried on page 235 of a first book. And so I literally copied out this material, or material that sort of surfaces here, and pasted it in a document and just sort of left it there. That was in 2016. And I've been shuttling back and forth between this material and a whole range of other things in the interim, ultimately trying to develop a book project that is a multi-species history of the development of plantations in Brazil, as a way of trying to understand the way in which capitalism helps pattern, if not determine, human, non-human interactions in the colonies. But I've been working at this intermittently interrupted by frequent administrative work, then of course the pandemic. I've tried to keep what I'm going to present here compact and clear. I'm also trying to write this up basically as a story. And so more than I prefer to do, I'll actually be reading a bit from what I have written up here. So I want to address some pretty challenging empirical questions about science and colonialism. Because this is very much a project in motion, I'll also say that what for me are some of, I think, the most exciting, forward-looking questions kind of remain, if not offstage, in the wings of the project that I have here. So what are these things? Indigenous history, the colonial origins of what I'm increasingly inclined to refer to as non-quantitative probabilistic thinking. There's an important history of mathematics, of risk, of speculation that is here. That becomes important because an emergence of that kind of sensibility has to underwrite the development of speculative investment, which then underwrites, of course, the development of plantations and capitalism going forward. That is what I broadly am trying to draw into this term plantation capitalism, but all of that remains in process. They're not here. I have a lot of ideas. I would say, roughly organized on those topics for now. And I'm happy to respond to questions about those dimensions of the project in the Q&A. Okay. Part 1, Introduction. 16th century Brazil is something of a riddle for anyone interested in science, society, and colonialism in the early modern world. The earliest letters introducing Brazil to European readers praised its exotic abundance. Yet, in an age that was obsessed with the new and the unusual, and this is a trope of the historiography of the period, people are obsessed with learning about the outside world. Europeans are obsessed with learning about the outside world, which they are not familiar with. But it wasn't until the closing decades of the 16th century, some 80 years after the first Portuguese landfall, that would-be Portuguese naturalists finally began to inventory the contents of the natural world of South America. In other words, even as reports about... Even as reports about the flora and fauna of Asia flowed steadily into Lisbon from the Estado da Índia, Portugal's empire in Asia, almost from its inception at the beginning of the 16th century, Portuguese interest in Brazilian nature was most remarkable for its absence. Most of the texts that finally elaborated upon Brazilian flora and fauna, those by Fernão Cardim, Pedro Magalhães de Gandavo, and Gabriel Soares de Souza, are well known to anyone familiar with the history of colonial Brazil, and I'll be referencing the texts of these three authors as I move through the material today. But the single most valuable natural history of Brazil from this transformative period also remains, I think, the least studied and most misunderstood. Ambrósio Fernandes Brandão's Diálogos das Grandezas do Brasil offers a rare window into the practices of knowledge-making, what we would call science, that had come to characterize Brazil by the turn of the 17th century. Sorry, I realize I'm a little behind my slides here. This is one of the other texts that I referenced. This is not the main text by Brandão. Unlike the expository reportage typical of Gandavo, Souza, and Cardim, and you see Gandavo's História da Província de Santa Cruz here in front of you, unlike books like this, the one that I'm concerned with by Brandão was written as a dialogue. Its 6 chapters included a diverse cast of characters, from Tupi pajés or shamans to Portuguese merchants and Austrian noblemen. In doing this, the Diálogos reveals, I think, the ways in which colonial ideologies, merchant capitalism, and a culture of collecting that linked Pernambuco in Brazil to Prague and to the Indian Ocean all combined to give shape and texture to the production of natural history in Brazil. In other words, I think global concerns are patterning the development of science in the colony. This project is, among other things, an attempt to understand something about how science, that is, how truth claims about nature, and about what exactly exists in nature, were produced in the period before more famous institutions like the Royal Society of London gave us the modern probabilistic fact born of mechanical manipulation. And that's usually what we think of when we think of science. Systematic, repeatable, experimental practice that yields probabilistic facts born of mechanical manipulation. What I'm ultimately trying to say here is that other forms of fact-making also came into existence in the early modern period, and that these were co-produced in violent and deeply unequal, but also profoundly generative colonial settings. And that these kinds of science were formative for plantation agriculture, for the development of capitalism, and ultimately for patterning capitalism's profound capacity for destruction and immiseration. And that's the bigger argument. More narrowly, Brandão's text in particular also challenges a long-standing historiographical contention among specialists of Brazil that colonial sugar planters were little interested in the unfamiliar plants and animals that surrounded them, that their perspective was limited by an ethos that focused attention on personal finance, family status, and Atlantic commerce. The lack of universities or printing presses, which so distinguished not only Portuguese America from Spanish America, but from Portuguese Goa as well. In other words, there were no printing presses, there were no universities in colonial Brazil, There were printing presses in universities all over colonial Spanish Americas, I'm sure some of you know. But the lack of those in Brazil would seem to support this long-standing interpretation that there was a sort of a lack of intellectual life in colonial Brazil. And for those reasons, the study of print culture and of authorship and readership in Portuguese America also remains in its infancy. Brandão, the author that I'm concerned with here, was well aware that, much like modern historians today, his contemporaries in metropolitan Portugal held the intellectual life of the colony in notably low regard. In his Diálogos, however, Brandão offered an alternative portrait. Portuguese America, he argued, was not simply where one learned how to make a good business deal, and it's a quote from this text. It was a crossroads of the world, he described it, a public academy, in which one learned all manner of civility and polite discourse and courteous behavior, and other accomplishments of similar importance. What Brandão referred to in Brazil is what I've elsewhere termed a culture of natural inquiry. The distinct combination of interests, priorities, techniques, and participants that, taken together, distinguish the study of nature in different theaters of empire. Brandão's Diálogos put on display for metropolitan readers the culture of natural inquiry, or science, that characterized colonial Brazil. It dramatizes the diversity of colonial humanity, the interplay of multiple creatures and multiple knowledges. Here I want to illustrate the dynamic and multifaceted cultural intellectual life to which Brandão gestured. To do so, I want to look at one particularly difficult and far-reaching classificatory problem, a problem that he and his contemporaries were forced to resolve. Great. Part 2, food for thought. As Brandão described the situation, Portugal's American colonies presented things so strange the mind cannot believe they exist in this world. Wild boars seemed to have navels not on their bellies, but upon their backs, and rodents used pockets to bear and raise their young. Salamanders survived in the blaze of colonial furnaces, while chameleons changed colors and fed only upon the air. Along the shore, crabs lived like ants, burrowed beneath the ground and plundered fruits and vegetables on the vine. Links even between predator and prey, plant and animal, food and poison were in disarray. A skilled bowman might pierce the flesh of a particular kind of monkey, but these creatures were as likely as not to pull the arrow out and fling it deftly back, forcing the archer to retreat and find cover. A rare, broad-leaved plant recoiled when it was touched, and manioc, the colonial staple, was filled with a poison so potent it could kill. In short, in Brazil, nature was not simply strange and miraculous, but sea creatures threatened crops, predators became prey, plants were sentient, and foods could kill. Any attempt to catalog this strange variety was bound to draw observers into a veritable, quote, labyrinth of names and forms. Nowhere were the problems of menace, disorder, and disorientation more apparent than in the intertwined cases of manatees and sea monsters. And nowhere were the colonial techniques devised to deal with these taxonomic tangles so clearly worked out as in Brandão's handling of them. Let me just check here. Okay. Manatees were widely distributed along coastal and northeastern Brazil in the 16th and 17th centuries. Not only along the coast, but also from the Amazon and its tributaries in the north to the Paraguaçu and the many smaller rivers that watered Bahia and the Recôncavo further south. Each year, these rivers grew swollen with the rains of March, and manatees would migrate upriver, grazing in the grassy shallows. Though most vulnerable in the spring, they could be hunted in all seasons. Slow and massive, Gundavo put their weight at anywhere between 40 and 50 arrobas, or 1,280 and 1,600 pounds. They were easy prey for a brawny team of skilled harpoonists. A single one of these peculiar fleshy creatures could feed a village. And as all of the earliest observers in Brazil readily conceded, manatee made for delightful fare. Whether smoked, stewed, minced, chopped, dressed with greens, or seasoned, marinated in its own fat, or in vinho de alho, the meat of the manatee was a pleasure to the palate. And all of those terms I just threw at you were all quotes from these texts. colonial observers loved to eat manatee. Yet along with these culinary delights came a gustatory riddle. For although the manatee lived, ate, and swam in the water, it tasted decidedly unlike a fish. Gandalf, Souza, and Cagle and Brandão variously offered comparisons with mutton, bacon, and pork, but they could all agree that the manatee tasted like nothing so much as a choice cut of beef. That alimentary affiliation inspired its Portuguese moniker. The creature was dubbed the peixe boy, the fish cow, and no one, Gandalf insisted, would believe it was a fish if they had not seen it first. But Brandão claimed to have once put a friend to the test and indeed found him utterly incredulous. The manatee, explained Cagle, even looked like an animal of the land, and, as he says, principally a cow. Now, accounts varied in their particulars, but descriptions uniformly drew attention to the very definitely bovine affinities of this distinctly unfamiliar sea-dwelling creature. Gandalf stressed the snout, thick lips, long whiskers, and smooth, tough skin. It might have had a flat tail, rather, quote, like a fish, noted Sousa. But it seemed to swim not with fins, but as if it had arms, a maneira de braços. It had no scales, he observed, but here distinguishing his account from Gandalf's, seemed to be covered with short, auburn-colored hair. The ambiguity they all noted was more than skin-deep. It was Cagle who described at greatest length the particular features that distinguished this notably unfishy creature, its parts and their sizes, proportions, and apparent functions. A survey of its interior parts, its intestines, lungs, liver, and, I quote, etc., seemed indeed to be just like those of a cow. But it is true, the surface parts of the manatee, along with its habits, that captured Cagle's attention. He noted its leathery hide and its large round tail, and he pointed out the hairs, dark red in color, that lightly covered it. He thought it oddly proportioned and found its eyes to be, quote, very small in the extreme given the size of its body. The eyelids drew more commentary, for the manatee, he found, could open and close them whenever it wanted, which, as Cagle pointedly noted, was something that, quote, other fish cannot do. Rather than fins, he described two short arms. It had round hands like paws, each with 5 fingers, and, quote, each of those attached to one another, and each with its own, quote, human-like fingernail. He observed that unlike other fish, manatees could not stay underwater. They had to surface in order to breathe. And below the arms, the females had 2 teats with which they nursed their children, and those they bore but one at a time. Strange fish indeed. Now, it was not by that Fernão Cagle, a Jesuit priest and sometime rector of the colleges of Bahia and Hugh, described the manatee in such exceptional detail. Whether the manatee was a creature of the land or of the water was of pressing and even existential importance. Confusion brought about by the combination of its fishy habitat and its bovine taste and appearance threatened to make a mockery of the natural divisions that underpinned one of the Catholic colony's most vital religious rituals. Fasting had been a mark of Christian belonging for the better part of a millennium by the time that the earliest Atlantic voyages were underway. As the practice of Lenten and weekly fasts spread across Western Christendom, what was once an exercise in stringent renunciation had instead come to mean merely abstention from the hearty fare of meat, milk, and eggs. On so-called fast days, fish could be eaten instead. Early modern cookbooks registered these shifts. Unlike their medieval predecessors, they increasingly separated meat and fish recipes. In Portugal, Domingos Rodrigues' Arte de Cozinha, which you see here, at least the title page, went so far as to use that distinction as its principal organizational device, speaking of book history. Ritual abstinence was easy enough as long as Catholic observers could sort their God's creatures into one of the 3 genesical divisions: creatures that fly, creatures that swim, and creatures that crawl. An organization that privileged habit, including, in this case, habitat, and mode of locomotion. The manatee's peculiar characteristics made it rather difficult to distinguish an unfamiliar fish from a common cow. That a manatee lived, fed, and died in the water was beyond question, but the unmistakably bovine quality of its entrails, appearance, and even the taste of its flesh augured in favor of a certain terrestrial belonging. Whether a manatee could properly be called a fish, and therefore when in the liturgical calendar it could and could not be eaten, had rather definite moral implications. And this was not a purely religious question. Were the unusual creature ranked with the cow for liturgical purposes, planters would need to find, sugar planters that is, would need to find alternative sources of food for their charges. And in fact, Souza and Brandão, both of whom were sugar planters, probably knew about the manatee so well because they had seen Tupi, that is, indigenous hunters, catch, slaughter, and distribute manatee flesh. In other words, the planters themselves aren't tromping out into riverine Brazil to slaughter and disassemble these creatures. The native peoples were resettled into Jesuit encampments as part of Portuguese colonialism, and especially in times of epidemic, disease, and consequent famine, would need to replace what for them was one of the most abundant and easily accessed sources of sustenance in their weakest and most vulnerable moments, if manatee were prohibited. That potential dietary dilemma was, of course, created and sharpened by Portuguese colonialism itself, and especially by the proliferation of sugar plantations and Jesuit missions. In other words, and to be clear, both the classificatory problem itself and its existential stakes were all products of Portuguese colonialism. Science and society are necessarily intertwined. Cagle conceded that by the time he had arrived near the end of the 16th century, this particular question about the manatee had given rise to, quote, misgivings. Brandão rather more pointedly referred to, quote, lengthy disputes and that certain unnamed, quote, theologians, he's almost certainly referring to Cagle, had been compelled to take up the issue. Now, he may have been referring to Cagle and the inquisitorial coterie with which he traveled, but can't be sure, at least not yet. Part 3. The manatee as monster. So unsettling was the manatee to the entwined natural, moral, and economic orders of the colony that its very peculiarity, a fish that in so many particulars resembled a terrestrial creature, came to define colonial monstrosity itself. Alongside their descriptions of the manatee, Gandavo, Souza, and Cagle were all compelled to comment at length on the appearance in Brazil of a rather more menacing creature. The Ipupiara, or, here I'm quoting, water demon, immortalized by Gandavo in a widely reproduced woodcut, shared the telltale bovine anatomy of its fishy relation, though certain anatomical details, as you can see here, were embellished. Unlike the innocuous manatee, the Ipupiara was more menacing. Rather than teeth and fingernails, Gandavo gave it fangs and claws. It was not bound to the watery shallows, but could also come ashore where, as Gandavo observed, it could stand upright, quote, like a man. And it was there, wrote Cagle, that the Ipupiara was at its most threatening. Ashore and upright, they looked, quote, disturbingly like a woman. With long hair, Cagle admitted, they were, in fact, very beautiful. The Ipupiara had a knack for enacting the very kinds of transgressions that its parts seemed to imply. With its womanly figure, the creature seduced colonial men, lured them into its grasp, and crushed them in a nightmarish embrace. A distinctly finicky killer, the manatee, as Ipupiara, fed selectively on the bodies of its prey, leaving ravaged eyes, collapsed noses, and mangled genitalia. With its capacity to cross boundaries, confuse categories, violate moral norms, and seduce Catholic men, it inspired a deviant sexuality and killed through affection. The Ipupiara was an emblem of particular colonial anxieties. The entwined tensions of gender and sexuality were pervasive, a consequence of the contradiction between church efforts to propagate the values of a patriarchal family on the one hand, and the frequency among most colonists of alternative and rarely also consensual unions. Illegitimate children and female-headed households sprang up and were pervasive in colonial Brazil. These kinds of preoccupations, linked to untamed sexuality, were the basis as well for ecclesiastical concerns with sodomy, which, after crypto-Judaism, was the most frequent accusation and confession, among the most frequent accusations and confessions heard when the Inquisition made the first of its 3 visitations, also at the end of the 16th century. And that's why Cagle was in town in the first place. The telltale disfigurement that marked its victims suggests that the Ipupiara, the manatee as monster, registered other anxieties as well. It had a penchant for appearing, that is, the Ipupiara, had a penchant for appearing in the midst of epidemic calamity. All 3 of the recorded appearances of the Ipupiara that I have found in the 16th century coincided with the outbreak of disease. When an Ipupiara appeared in 1564 and, according to Gundabu, attacked the young Fejeda, the son of a donatary captain, it's a member of the colonial elite, it happened when a peace with the Tupinamba at Guanabara Bay in Rio hung in the balance, and while the French threat to the area was still real, and as a foiled plot by the Tupiniquin, another indigenous group allied with the French, threatened to exterminate local Jesuits. Those kinds of events, those threats to colonialism, lingered in popular memory. The 2 appearances reported by Cagle in Jaguaripe and Porto Seguro both occurred in 1582, in precisely the years that a combination of epidemic disease, widespread hunger, and religious tumult swept the coast there, a time in which Jesuit claims about the causes and treatment of disease had proven manifestly false, and in which the ranks of the Jaguaripe Santidade movement, which is a sort of a syncretic religious movement in resistance to plantation agriculture, had begun to spring up. What was left of the bodies said to be ravaged by monstrous manatees reflected the very real ravages of the great pox, or syphilis, in the colonies. Blindness, collapsed noses, mangled genitalia were and remain hallmarks of acute syphilis. Part 4, Discerning Palates. The Ipupiara would live on. It remains a name for the pink dolphins of the Amazon, a creature subject to similar tales of boundary crossing. Mixed race persons of the Amazon are said to be descendants of their unions with native women. But the manatee, meanwhile, remained a problem of knowledge. How to place such a bedeviling creature into an intelligible order of nature? Metropolitan naturalists, who had been quick to take up the study of plants, embraced animals much more slowly. I should just note here, the study of plants in the early and middle of the 16th century was what we might refer to today as big science. Massive amounts of money is flowing into the study of plants, both within early modern Europe, but also across increasingly sprawling European imperial world. But as naturalists did take up the study of animals, unfamiliar animals in the colonies, as they did so, it was to Aristotle, and especially to his Historia Animalium, that they turned for guidance. Now, Aristotle's categories provided some direction, but a careful reading of his texts revealed writing that teemed with overlapping and competing distinctions, arrangements nearly as protean as the natural world they had intended to describe. The Greek philosopher, it turned out, had not intended to construct a single, comprehensive, and hierarchically ordered system of classification. He had arranged and then rearranged his categories to suit the shifting focus of his inquiry. Identifying relationships between creatures could hinge, in other words, for Aristotle, on a whole range of differentiating criteria, including observable physical features, characteristic habitat, and where, how, and what a creature ate, where it slept, how it reproduced, its, quote, manner of life, and its, quote, activities, the acuity of its senses, its imagination, its apparent memory, its intelligence, its personality traits. Could a creature be jealous, fearless, lecherous? Aristotle's classifications could also hinge on whether, how, and to what degree it socialized, or its, quote, disposition. In other words, the classical texts to which early modern naturalists were inclined to look for guidance when it came to sorting out unfamiliar plants and animals offered no guidance at all whatsoever. Hence, which aspects of an animal were most suited for general classification, which should have more or less diagnostic priority, was an open question when 16th century naturalists in Europe variously attempted to answer such question and to create such a system. Most observers took the distinction between terrestrial and marine animals as fundamental. This is a distinction shorn up, of course, no doubt, by the Bible. Yet, even in the case of the humble cow, that eminently familiar creature that proved a convenient referent for the distinctly unfamiliar manatee, the authors of the two most influential animal encyclopedias of the 16th century could not agree on how best to render a classification. Conrad Gessner and Ulysses Aldrovandi both described it as a blooded quadruped, but for greater precision, Gessner used the divisions between viviparous and oviparous creatures, between those that bore live young or that reproduced through eggs, through the laying of eggs. Aldrovandi, by contrast, sorted this and other creatures according to whether they had single or cloven hooves. In other words, what I'm getting at here, I apologize for burying you into the arcane details of 16th century natural history. What I mean to say is, if the common, indeed ubiquitous cow could not be easily sorted, how much more difficult would it be to sort the manatee? Exactly which of its parts were best suited to corral this wayward fish cow into its proper taxonomic pen? This was an open question, and it would remain so for decades. By the time Brandão set quill to page in Pernambuco, around 1617, publications on animals had actually turned away from multi-volume encyclopedias to shorter treatises of theoretical and methodological reflection. In Brazil, how would the manatee be sorted? Part 5. Sorting people, sorting things. In a colony in which cannibalism seemed rife, crypto-Judaism pervasive, and criminality and cultural promiscuity the rule, what one ate, when one ate it, and with whom one ate was one of the most basic markers of Catholic identity. Eating classified the eater. Now, a historian of ages gone by, Anthony Pagden, showed decades ago that the earliest European observers saw cannibalism as and perhaps the, fundamental flaw of indigenous American culture. It was a basic category error, a violation of natural law that cast doubt not only upon their intellectual capacity, but their very humanity. As Iberian settlement got underway, Spanish and Portuguese colonial authorities placed particular stress over what one did and did not eat. As historian Rebecca Earle has shown for the Spanish Americas, eating the wrong thing could make one not simply sinful, but it could change the very kind of person one was. Eating could materially transform body and soul. And the same was true in Portuguese America. Amid the dislocations brought about by the joining of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns and the widespread migration of new Christians to points throughout Portugal's empire, and as the consequent concerns of crypto-Judaism grew more pronounced in colonial theaters ranging from South America to South Asia, confessions, denunciations, and personal defenses mustered before inquisitorial tribunals all often rested on what a person ate and whether they abided by so-called Friday fasts. What was a sugar planter like Brandão to do? He and his contemporaries in Brazil fashioned their own classificatory criteria. If the human world could be sorted by its habits of eating, then perhaps the animal world could as well. It was an approach already made available by the Aristotelian corpus, and in Brazil it was one which the tensions of colonialism had now fashioned into a fundamental tool of differentiation among humanity, a tool deployed by the Holy Office of the Inquisition to sustain a boundary that was carefully policed by a network of familiars and informants of that same office. Brandão and his contemporaries imported this approach to classification from the realm of the human into the realm of the animal. The planters and Jesuit priests would all agree that, taken together, what a creature ate, where it ate, and among whom it ate, all constituted, and I quote, the decisive point when it came to settling all such questions on the classification of unfamiliar creatures. The manatee may have looked and tasted rather like a cow, but its unambiguous preference for feeding in the water signaled a distinctly aquatic kinship. Manatees were fish. Solutions to the problem of knowledge, what kind of creature was the manatee, were solutions to the problem of social order. How should humans themselves be sorted and comport themselves? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there's an opportunity for a rich discussion. We've got about 20 minutes. We recognize that some of you may have classes you need to attend at 1, and you're welcome to leave when you need to leave. But we invite you to ask questions to Professor Cagle. If you have a question, just raise your hand. Adie here has a microphone, and she'll bring it to you. We invite you to stand and tell us your name. And if you're a student, maybe tell us your major, what you're studying at BYU. And we will go until 1 p.m. or until our questions are exhausted. I'm going to take advantage of the podium for just a moment and ask you one question. So I enjoyed the way that you concluded here. And I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit more toward this strong impetus to sort and to classify. It seems like it was quite disturbing for colonizers when they couldn't classify. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the European worldview that brought us to that point. And if the Brazilian colonists over time ended up breaking with classifications from Europe because of their new circumstances, or if they were essentially bound to European ways of understanding the world.
Couple of things. Great question. Also great technique. I think I'm going to import this into my way of handling speakers when I have them up to Utah. Go ahead and ask the first question yourself to give everyone a chance to sort of think. That's excellent. And I would also say, when you do ask questions, I would love to know what your majors are, what areas you're studying. This is a fascinating opportunity to figure out what people are interested in here. Sorting. That's tough. One of the, I would say, a sort of dominant way of understanding the Iberian colonial world is that it forces European colonizers to recast or rearrange a series of dominant classifications. In 1450, it is quite clear that within Iberia we have a handful of competing kingdoms, not just Portugal, but under what is the unified crown of Spain. We have a whole range of kingdoms formally administered separately as sovereign kingdoms, and not yet subsumed under the common identity of Castilian or later Spanish. And so what happens as a consequence of encounters in the Americas is that the categories through which Europeans, the Spaniards and Portuguese themselves, begin to identify themselves get shorn up. And this is, I think, a fairly well-known part of the history of early modern Spanish colonialism. It's probably less the case for the Portuguese. But what you get is the emergence of Castilian as an overarching category of identity for Spaniards. It is also in the beginning of the 16th century when the first royal dictionary of the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language is first produced. So the Spanish language itself becomes codified, becomes systematized. Dictionaries are put out in order to ensure that everyone who speaks Spanish speaks the king's Spanish. The Portugal's a little bit different, and I think we're still trying to make sense of what these differences were between Spaniards and Portuguese. there is, for reasons that are hard to explain outside of, I think, an unsatisfying essentialist explanation, that the Portuguese, for whatever kinds of cultural reasons, were just less inclined to centralized administration. And I can tell you from having worked in Portuguese archives, seemingly less inclined to just centralized organization, candidly. Just there was no such thing. And in fact, the Portuguese language today is characterized by a whole range of Portuguese that it is just different from Mozambique and Angola to India, where, by the way, descendants of Portuguese colonial families still proudly speak Portuguese at home, if not out and about in Goa, to Brazil. There is no single standard unified dictionary of the Portuguese language, even today, as there is for Spain. So these encounters are encouraging the crystallization of categories of identity, but it is not a unified story across the Spains, as they were called at the beginning of the 16th century, plural, and Portugal. As far, I mean, on the colonial side, what I would say is that, goodness, what can I say? Yeah, I think I'll just stop there and see if anyone has any other questions. Now I'm trying to pull the safety cord on this extemporaneous reflection on the will to order colonial society, which is a long-standing topic in colonial Latin American literature or historiography. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Rex Nielsen, and my area is Portuguese and Brazilian literature and culture.
Oh, excellent. Maybe you can answer the question on.
No, but
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about. So I'm familiar with the treatment of the manatee as a monstrous figure,
Mm-hmm.
but as you were talking, I was also thinking about another frame that the manatee is often, I guess, categorized or described, which is in terms of its laziness. And I was thinking about other animals in Brazil, like the bicho preguiça, and other animals that are considered to be lazy, and the way that category of laziness gets extended to indigenous peoples as part, during the colonial period. And I wondered how that might, figure into your reading of the manatee.
Yeah. Thank you for that. This is great. So this kind of, well, I should say a kind of unwritten dimension of this story, is that the Ipupiara is not. There's a debate about where this category, this language Ipupiara, comes from. I think it is straightforwardly indigenous category that colonial Portuguese adopt and deploy to the manatee, kind of interchangeably, which is to say that Portuguese are beginning to think about at least the non-human world in many of the ways in which that indigenous people do, or at least coastal Tupi-speaking people do. The trope of laziness, though, has not yet been attached to the manatee, and has not yet been attached, I would say, in on-the-ground encounters to indigenous people. Which is to say that there is a I mean, this actually does get back to the question of categorizing, of creating boxes and then filling it with content. So I would say that the sort of ascription of laziness, indolence, undirection to native communities is something that is a process that has to happen over time. I think that's in place by the turn of the 17th century, but in the middle of the 16th century, I think that is still very much an open question. And the categories or the attributes of the manatee, both manatee qua manatee and manatee as Ipupiara, are much more a kind of vigorous waywardness, a kind of impulsiveness. These, of course, are also tropes of in the discourses around indigenous communities at the time. So it is true that there is traffic, but we don't get this like the ascription of indolence yet. So, but it is a pattern. The other question then is, okay, so is this pattern of ascriptive identity, is this something that is strictly linked to, or is it strictly done by the Portuguese toward their indigenous interlocutors? In other words, like, basically, do people see themselves as representative of a single monolithic culture group coming into contact with another single monolithic culture group? And what I would argue here is that although that is a position staked out by, I would say, most Brazilianists working today, at least in the discipline of history, I think that if you pay attention to the documents themselves, and this is actually something I'm kind of at work on in this project, those categories are just too clumsy. Like these monolithic categories that insist that two culture groups coming into contact with one another, like that was actually borne out by the source material. And we can't explain basic things like the development of plantation agriculture if we do that, because ultimately, as is well known among, I would say 2 generations ago, early historians thinking about plantation development in colonial Brazil, a sort of founding generation of scholars, Alexander Marchand, for example, Richard Morse, the early plantations were only survived with the collaboration of indigenous communities. And so, as I think about the ways in which ascriptions of like inherent quality are applied across sort of cultural boundaries, I don't want to reduce that to the cultural boundary ostensibly between the Portuguese themselves and the indigenous communities. I actually think it's way more complicated than that. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I study psychology and global women's studies. So I'm interested about the thought processes behind a lot of things. I also have a manatee monster question. Specifically, you mentioned that like a lot of the sightings that coincided with disease outbreaks and things like that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on like how that would have been meaningful for the people there, and like why this idea of a monster could have, I don't know, like would have coincided with these diseases, like what that would have done for the people, if that makes sense?
I'm not sure. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, just like why would you say that like those sightings coincided with those outbreaks?
Yes.
How would that have been meaningful for those people to like attribute maybe those things to a monster? What did that kind of do for the culture there?
Yeah, so this is great, and this is a kind of, thank you very much for the question. This is, how much time do we have to talk about the way in which colonial disease is absolutely inexplicable for the people who are encountering it? The Portuguese find the outbreak of disease, and I would say historical epidemiologists continue to find the outbreak of disease, especially smallpox in the Americas, to be something of a mystery. Here I've described circulation of syphilis, smallpox, anything that can be sort of loosely grouped under the category of cutaneous pustules of one kind or another begin to sweep through the colonies. And I would say as we pay attention to early epidemic disease in the Americas, it's those, this is why I like history of science so much, those actor categories that are really important for understanding. At any rate, the Jesuits come in and they have a whole range of explanations for what is causing the outbreaks of disease. And I would say they all loosely boil down to, well, we're being bad Catholics, right? And so if we're just better Catholics, then we would not be afflicted with these, with the ravages of these diseases. And what they find is that no amount of being a better Catholic seems to stave off epidemic disease. No amount of successful conversion seems to explain an outbreak of disease, and no amount of indigenous resistance to resettlement into Jesuit communities seems to prevent or forestall disease. And what happens is, over time, the Jesuits' description, attempts to explain disease, break down. And it's actually, I have a related project to this on the history of emotion. The Jesuits themselves, it's as if their inability to explain disease, to account for it, it's not only failing to satisfy among indigenous communities, it fails to satisfy Jesuits themselves. And if you read the letters back and forth between individual Jesuit communities in Brazil, which are much different than reading the better-known Jesuit relations or letters sent back to Rome, but just the letters that are sort of circulating in the colony from one group of Jesuits to another. They are stunningly riddled with profound depths of uncertainty. And you can tell this in all kinds of ways. Their grammar changes. The way that they construct sentences in these letters changes. I mean, it is very striking. You only know this if you bury yourself. I mean, there's literally 12 volumes of these letters in Brazil. If you just read those back to back to back to back, you can really begin to see shifts in epistolary practice. At any rate, so all of that uncertainty is going on, and I think that helps constitute a world that just itself is just uncertain, and so that makes it possible to imagine the manatee as this other creature. And the thing about, and this loops back to the other question, is that this category of the Ipupiara as a kind of Jekyll and Hyde type creature, it's already out there, it's live, it's available. It's what most of the people who live along the coast of Brazil understand the manatee to be like. They are on the one hand these gentle, supple creatures. They are on the other hand these completely unpredictable beings. And so it's in that context of profound uncertainty on all sides that it becomes possible to imagine this manatee as this monster that's threatening colonial communities in this very frontal way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, the way in which disease helps, I think, restructure categories of emotion, categories of feeling, helps change how it is possible to suffer, is, I think, an underappreciated story of the history of epidemic disease in Brazil. And this is actually what I think helps. It creates an opening for new forms of human-animal relationship. And that's actually one of the directions of the project. Chapter 3 in a tentative new book manuscript. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm a student here at BYU. My name is Annie Walker. I'm studying editing and publishing. I'm curious as to what you're saying about how the myth raised questions about gender and sexuality. Do you think that this myth was also used, or do you know if this myth was also used to impose like European morality onto natives, or was it more focused on the European colonists who lived there?
Oh, yes, 100%. Yeah, no question. Indigenous practices around sexuality are very different. Indigenous practices around family organization, agriculture, any kind of, I would say, sort of care work are completely different from those of the Portuguese and lend weight to these other, ultimately more derogatory ascriptions of sort of moral personhood to indigenous communities. No question. And you see that inscribed in colonial law. By the 17th century, the crown is perfectly willing to begin to authorize enslavement of indigenous people. Unlike the Spanish Americas, the Portuguese Americas, for example, there was no Las Casas Sepúlveda debate that debated the humanity of indigenous people. That never happened. And then later, at the turn of the 17th century, the crown is finally just like, okay, it's fine to enslave some of these people. Only some of them, but absolutely, and it's unbridled. And it had been going on in practice, since 1511, but yeah, those kinds of differences legitimate enslavement by 1600. Yeah. Anyone else? One last question? Thank you, those of you who are shuttling these mics around. I really appreciate it.
Nice talk. Thank you very much. I'm Zach Chase in the anthropology department. I work on early modern and modern colonial, mostly in Latin America. This was terrific. I had several ideas that came to mind. I wondered this item that you presented about what, where, and among whom a creature ate, becoming this pivotal aspect of classification. I wonder, I'm not as familiar with Portuguese America, if there are other ingestible substances that work in similar ways. So I've written something on coca that works pretty much the same way, but then there's tobacco, there's chocolate, and it seems to me that perhaps this sort of thing ramifies so that there would be primary decisions based on, okay, so we eat potatoes. Potatoes are great, no problem. Why? Well, because we can compare them to turnips, for example, or other things that we know are eaten out of the ground and that are good and that are fine, even though they come from here, they're okay, but this is a bridge too far. Coca is a bridge too far. That's that's an Indian thing to do, and it becomes codified. Well, how do we know it's an Indian thing? Well, it comes from the Americas. Well, so do potatoes. Yeah, but who chews coca and who doesn't? Ah, okay, fair enough. It seems that the Indians chew coca and we don't. But that, of course, is a constructed thing that it goes. That it turns into, becomes more and more concretized. Are you familiar with any other tobacco? Is any coca making it into the area? Chocolate? Any of these other sorts of things?
Yeah, so tobacco is definitely circulating. I have always kind of assumed that cacao is out and about, although it doesn't really surface on the colonial Brazilian sources. So yeah, and I can't speak to coca. I think the challenge with the manatee is that you know, kind of like the potato, everyone is eating it. It has at least gustatorially an approximate analog. I think, but the problem really is not the thing itself, but because the manatee seems to cross these biblical categories, I think that's in this case, because like with coca, I think part of the problem with coca is it is used as a way among the Inca themselves as a way to allocate imperial power. I mean, it's such a symbol of Inca primacy, as I understand it, and I think that there's a similar story there for chicha, maize beer. I think for the manatee, it's that none of that is the problem. I think it gets at something deeper, that the way that we are told the universe is ordered might not be true. So I think it's a different kind of difference, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's not just, okay, is this something we're finding an analog, but if what we're basing that on violates the boundaries that we're familiar with, okay, now we're running into problems that maybe will keep this thing from being adopted wholesale for a longer time.
Yeah.
Entrenched forever.
Yeah, and if I can just say, and I know we're running out of time, and I thank you, just to take a 2 extra minutes just to close, I will say that this is, the manatee is a useful prism for doing some comparative colonial work, not just in the Americas, but across theaters of Portuguese empire building. In the very same years, in 1564, a series of dugongs related to the manatee in the early modern period, indistinguishable from the manatee, South Asian dugongs are netted by I think they're Sinhalese fishermen in the Gulf of Manaar in Southeast Asia, and a well-known Portuguese physician, Dimas Bosque, encounters these creatures. The villagers who are along the coast draw his attention to them. He's there because there's a Portuguese viceroy in Goa who's got some axe to grind with a local ruler. And what's so fascinating is the encounter, including the dissection of a couple of these dugongs, is absolutely unremarkable. No one cares. The physician himself, and this physician is friends with a much more famous Portuguese physician who writes the sort of Garcia de Horta, who writes a sort of iconic Portuguese natural history out of Portuguese Asia, published in Goa in 1563. It's the first text. It's not a Bible, published by the Portuguese there. So Dimas Bosque, he understands the curiosity surrounding new nature. He is not the least bit interested in these manatees. In other words, something is going on in Brazil in particular, and that's what I'm trying to get at, those tensions that define Brazil as a particular zone of colonialism. Something's going on in Brazil in particular that makes the manatee so troubling. And I think it's precisely this. It is a food staple, and everyone likes it. And yet, it can't be categorized. And that's just not the case in South Asia. So.
Thank you for your great questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.